Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. So, imagine for a second you're starting a brand new country completely from scratch. You've got big dreams, a shiny new constitution, but there is one massive problem. Your pockets are totally empty. Today we're exploring the early republic, and specifically, how the early United States learned to manage its money, pay its bills, and actually build a functioning economy. How a nation earns and manages its cash affects absolutely every single citizen. And honestly, the decisions they made back then are still rippling into our lives today.
To frame our whole explainer today, I want you to think about Proverbs 21:5, which says, "The plans of the diligent lead to profit." Now, this isn't just good advice for your own personal piggy bank, it's literally the foundation of good national economics. The early leaders of the United States had to be incredibly diligent. They had to sit down, face the reality of their situation, and plan carefully. Because good economic policy, it requires a mix of careful planning, hard work, and godly diligence. Without a solid plan, a nation simply cannot thrive.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the nation needs money, tariffs for revenue and protection, the whiskey tax controversy, the national bank debate, and we'll wrap up with godly wisdom and economics.
The nation needs money.
Okay, let's dive into this. The new government was carrying three really heavy burdens right out of the gate. First, they had to fund national defense to keep this young country safe. Second, they needed to build roads and infrastructure so people and goods could actually travel. And third, they had to pay off massive debts left over from winning their independence. The government desperately needed to raise cash just to survive, but they had very few options. I mean, how do you get the money you need without angering citizens who literally just fought an entire war over unfair taxes? It was the ultimate tightrope walk.
Section 2. Tariffs, Revenue and Protection.
So a tariff is a tax placed on imported goods coming into the country. Say a British merchant wants to sell tea or cloth or shoes in the United States. Well, they have to pay a tax just to bring those items across the border. It's a very direct way for a government to generate cash, but it also has a huge impact on how much everyday things cost at your local market.
Now, the crucial thing to remember is that not all tariffs are doing the same job. We basically have two flavors here. First, there's a revenue tariff. Its primary goal is exactly what it sounds like, raising money for the government. The tax is usually kept small enough that people are still going to buy the imported goods, which means a nice, steady stream of cash for the nation. But then, on the other hand, we have a protective tariff. The goal here is entirely different. It aims to shield domestic businesses. By slapping a super high tax on imported goods, it makes them so expensive that citizens will basically be forced to buy goods made locally instead. In the 1790s, the U.S. mostly relied on those modest revenue tariffs. But even those smaller taxes changed the cost of goods and sparked some pretty intense regional disagreements, depending on what people were buying and selling.
So, quick question for you. Imagine the government passes a tariff. It successfully raises a ton of money, but consumers go to the market and they just keep buying the exact same imported goods they always have. Their shopping habits barely change at all. What kind of tariff is that?
If you guessed a revenue tariff, you hit the nail on the head. This perfectly illustrates how a revenue tariff works in the real world. Because the tax isn't astronomically high, people just keep buying the imported goods. That means the government keeps collecting the tax on those goods, successfully funding the nation without totally flipping the market upside down.
Section 3. The Whiskey Tax Controversy.
Okay, so we just learned that tariffs are taxes on things coming into the country. But what about things made inside the country? Well, that is an excise tax, a tax placed on specific goods produced domestically. To help pay off those massive debts we talked about a minute ago, the early U.S. government decided to place an excise tax on a very specific domestic good: whiskey.
Now, this tax caused an absolute uproar, but only in certain places. Why do you think frontier farmers living inland hated this tax so much more than the merchants living on the coast? Like, why would geography change the economic impact of a tax?
What's really fascinating here is the answer. You see, for frontier communities, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was basically cash. Because transporting bulky grain over the mountains on those terrible dirt roads was nearly impossible, farmers would turn their grain into whiskey, which was way easier to move and sell. Inland, it practically functioned like money. So when the government taxed whiskey, they weren't just taxing some luxury item. They were directly attacking the frontier farmer's primary way of surviving. To the farmers, this felt incredibly unfair, and it really goes to show that a government has to carefully consider whether the national need for revenue outweighs the local pain it might cause.
Section 4. The National Bank Debate.
Moving on, let's see how they tried to build a stable economy out of all this.
With tariffs and excise taxes finally pulling money into the government, leaders needed a secure way to actually manage all this new cash. So they proposed a national bank, which had four main jobs: centralize all the federal funds into one safe place, issue reliable paper currency, make sure government bills were paid on time, and lend money to help stabilize the economy if a crisis hit. On paper, it sounded like a great way to steady the whole economy.
But, surprise, surprise, not everyone agreed it was a good idea. If we weigh the benefits against the risks, supporters argued the bank would provide a stable currency and reliable payments, which is huge for building investor trust. But critics, they were deeply worried about the concentration of financial power. They hated the idea of placing too much money and control into just one institution. And more importantly, they asked a pretty dangerous question. Is this even constitutional? Where in the Constitution does it explicitly say the federal government can create a bank? Supporters pushed back, arguing it fell under the power to do whatever was necessary and proper to run the country. And honestly, this intense debate over what necessary and proper actually means is a pattern you're going to see repeating throughout all of American history.
Section 5. Godly Wisdom and Economics.
All right, here are your 5 homework questions. This is a great opportunity to reflect on everything we just discussed, so go ahead and take a moment to jot these down. You're going to define an excise tax and give an insight from the 1790s, compare our 2 types of tariffs, explain how a bank acts as an economic stabilizer, and reflect on why geography changes a tax's impact. But I really want you to focus on question number 5. Which funding method seems fairest to you? Because navigating questions of fairness, that requires wisdom, not just economic math.
And that actually brings us to the core philosophy of the Heroesmartacademy Godly Learner series. Education without morality will hurt. We study complex topics like national banks and tariffs because, of course, we want to be educated. But think about it. What is the point of being smart, knowing all the facts, and supposedly being educated if you just continue to make choices that hurt yourself and the people around you? True education intertwines biblical morality with learning. The leaders of the early republic had to use serious wisdom to balance opportunity, fairness, and growth. And you need that exact same moral wisdom in your everyday life.
We can see this idea laid out perfectly in Romans 8:6-7, which says, "The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace." When you allow godly wisdom to guide your intelligence, it brings peace of mind. And that's true whether you're navigating your own personal daily choices or trying to wrap your head around the complex financial systems that run an entire nation.
So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with one final big thought. How will you apply spiritual mindedness to your own education and choices today? Are you just gathering facts to pass a test, or are you actually building the diligent moral character you need to use those facts wisely? Think about that as you tackle your homework. Thanks so much for learning with me today. Stay diligent out there, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.